Hello, everyone, and welcome to Azure AD Authentication and Microsoft Purview Access Policies, supported for SQL 2022 on Azure Arc-enabled servers. My name is Mirek Sztajno, and I'm a Senior Program Manager in SQL Server Security. And with me today, I have Srđan Božović, Senior Program Manager in SQL Server Security. Both of us are coming from the same group, from the security team. The session is divided into two parts, and I will be presenting Azure AD authentication for SQL 2022, and Srđan will present the Microsoft Purview access policies for SQL Server 2022. So let's start with the Azure AD authentication. In my presentation, I'll give the high-level overview of the Azure Active Directory, and then next going to the SQL Server support and requirements for the Azure AD authentication. That includes the setup, primary the Azure AD administrator setup, the permissions that are required to set up the Azure AD authentication administrator. I'll talk also about the authentication methods and tools that are supported, about the users, the AAD login and users created in SQL Server. We support the link server for SQL 2022, and I'll present a demo that encapsulates or above, and there's a documentation that we would like you to read. Azure Active Directory represents the central identity management system for Azure Cloud, and it allows to store and manage the identities across all services and platforms. Storing it centrally in one place simplifies the permission management for all services and other platforms. There's benefit of using the features that are available in Azure Active Directory, for example, the password rotation or password expiration, password policy. Azure AD provides the additional authentication protection, multi-factor authentication, MFA. It allows to manage individual users using groups. And last but not least, it is the alternative authentication to existing SQL Server, to SQL authentication and Windows authentication. It's used by employees to sign in and to access the Azure resources. It's used by the AD administrators to store the identities, to manage the identities. It's used by developers who can develop applications or doing their development using single sign-on. We use it for Azure services. And for example, Azure SQL is one of them. And then they also used by big releases like Microsoft 365, Office 365 Dynamics CRM. And it is supported for Azure services and hybrid platforms. The hybrid platforms, for example, SQL 2022 that can connect to Azure Cloud. Azure Active Directory supports different identity objects, users that can be the native users created in the AAD, the federated users that when the Windows when the Windows domain is federated with the Azure Active Directory, and then guest users, which are either users from another Active Directory or users like Outlook.com or Hotmail.com. It supports groups that can collect users and use the group identity on behalf of these users. And it supports service principals that are also called Azure AD applications that I use for system automation. And that includes the system and user managed identities. From the connection method standpoint, the user password method, which is not quite recommended because it requires the hard-coded password to be sent through the wires in the connection string. The federated authentication with Windows, which is a good one, it allows so-called a single sign-on if the Windows domain is federated with AAD authentication, the Windows credentials can be used. There's an interactive method that supports the multi-factor authentication, and it interactively enters the password. It's not stored anyplace. The token authentication that allows to obtain a token and then pass this token to a Azure service, like, for example, to SQL. The service principals that Azure AD applications that are used to automate it, the workload. And then last but not least, the system and user assigned managed identities. It is supported for all SQL SKUs. So AAD Auth is supported for SQL DB Hyperscale, for SQL DB for Hyperscale, for Managed Instance, Azure Data Warehouse. And recently, we supported for SQL Server 2022. It is in preview until the final release of SQL 2022. Going to the specifics to SQL Server, the AAD authentication is supported for Windows and Linux. Currently, it's only supported for SQL on premises, for the box only, and the SQL Server support on Azure VMs will be delivered later. It requires a registration with Azure Arc, so the AAD Auth requires Azure Arc, and the requirement is due to the fact that that Azure Arc connects the on-premise machine with Azure Cloud and uses the Azure Arc agent that is installed on the machine that is hosting SQL Server. In addition, the setup for Azure AD authentication requires the setup to Azure AD admin. And the admin can be the individual user, AD user, or service principal, or Azure AD application. And Azure AD admin must be set up for every SQL Server instance to access the Azure Active Directory. There are two steps required to set up the Azure AD authentication. The first step is a prerequisite, and it requires simply Azure Arc registration for the host machine and for SQL Server. So this registering the host machine allows connect Windows and Linux host with SQL Server to Azure Cloud, and through the installing Azure Arc agent on the server, we can access the individual SQL Server instances. The second step that is done outside of the SQL Server setup is the setup of the Azure AD authentication for SQL Server mainly set up the administrator that is chosen for Azure AD, as I mentioned before, user group or service principal. It requires a certificate that must be created in the Key Vault and stored locally on the machine. And then it requires the AAD application that is registered and assigned to the Key Vault certificate. And finally, once the AAD admin is set up, the Azure AD users can be created and mapped to users in SQL Server. The step-by-step documentation is available, and it's guiding through the setup process. Here's the summary of what elements are required. And as you can see, we have three big elements here. Objects, the first one is the Azure Cloud. Then there's the host machine, the SQL that is hosting SQL Server on SQL on premises. And then there's the application. The first step is to register server, the host server, with Azure Arc and the SQL Server with Azure Arc. This registration is creating Azure Arc agent on the host machine. The next step is to provide an Azure AD object that will be used to set up Azure AD administrator for SQL Server, and either using a system or user management. I'll talk about it later. Once these elements are in place, that includes the certificate creation, that includes the application creation, all the information that is needed to support the Azure AD administrator is transferred to Azure Arc agent, and then it's transferred to SQL instance, to individual instance. Once the Azure AD administrator is set up, it can connect to the machine using its credential, and then from there I can connect to Azure Active Directory and proceed with the tasks that are required from the admin. One of them is to create another users, AAD users in SQL Server. We offer different APIs for the Azure AD administrator setup. There's a portal, the new Azure AD admin blade. There's an ARM template, PowerShell script, and Azure CLI scripts. The last three allows the automation to create or to change the AAD admin using the template or using the scripts. There are two setup modes that are available. The one is the user managed mode, and the other is the service managed mode. The user managed mode requires the user to provide a certificate and to provide the application with all permissions. The service managed mode is creating it for a user. So it creates the Azure application and certificate. It's created by the system. And the requirement here is to provide the Azure Key Vault that exists before. There's a step-by-step documentation that documents all these steps, and that documents the setup automation as well, the APIs. A user who is setting up an AAD admin must have a special RBAC permissions that are required for this setup. And the first one is for the Azure Arc. A user must be a member of the contributor role for Azure Arc Server, the host machine, and Azure Arc SQL Server, the SQL Server instance. Such user must also be be part of the contributor role for a key vault that is needed to create a certificate. And in the key vault, in additional, must have special permissions for the access policy in the key vault itself. And this is for on one side, this is for the host machine, but on another side, this is for the user itself. Finally, to enable the application to be fully functional, an admin consent is required to this application to access the Microsoft Graph. Microsoft Graph is accessed when a graph is accessed to create a user or to create a login. If this consent is not provided, then the Azure Active Directory is not fully functional. And only a global administrator or privileged role administrator can grant such consent. These are high privilege users, but the granting admin consent is a one-time process. Once it's granted for an application, this application can be used to switch between the AD admins. And that's below why we are saying that if the application or certificate exist, so the only permission that the user who is setting up an admin is the Azure Arc contributor role. Summarizing the authentication methods and SQL tooling support, as I mentioned before, for SQL 2022, we support the AAD user password, the federated authentication or Windows authentication, the interactive authentication with MFA, the token authentication. From the tooling support standpoint, the tools are supported, SSMS, SQL CMD, Azure Data Studio, and then Invoke SQL CMD supports the token authentication. To create a user, AAD user or login in SQL Server, we have a special syntax that exists for Azure SQL today. We extended this syntax to SQL Server 2022. And to create user, we create login, we use create login and then add from external provider. And with the view sys server principles, this user can be viewed. To create a user with this login, we use the existing syntax where we give the AAD user, for example, and use the AAD user login. It is possible also to create the contained users without logins in a database. That syntax is also here from external provider. There's nothing new related to Azure SQL. That's all is supported for Azure SQL. And in the last case, to check this user, we use the sys database principles view. We support link server with certain prerequisites. Obviously, the main prerequisite is this Azure AD authentication must be installed. The SSMS version 18 and higher must be used. The instance trust each other. The instances trust each other using the SSL certificate that must be in place. And then with this, for Azure AD authentication, we support two modes today, which is the Azure password and Azure token. And there's a link below to indicates how to set it up. In SQL 2022, we released the new fixed server level roles. that allows users with a lower permissions without having system admin access to manage the databases. These roles are granted to logins in MasterDB. They are supported for all authentication methods for SQL 2022. So for SQL authentication, Windows authentication, and Azure AD authentication. And each of these roles has a specific set of permissions and is represented by a ## server role name ##. These roles, they apply to all databases. And if there's a need to remove a certain database from this role, there's a deny operation that can be used. Also, I'd like to mention that the new server, fixed server roles are supported in Azure SQL DB. These roles is this fixed roles is a nice segue to Srđan's presentation on the Purview, because it shows the differences between using the T-SQL directly and then using a Purview to access the database. The roles are indicated here. We are in the process of adding more. So if you want to read more, look for the documentation indicated below. I will be focusing on the first one, on the database connector that allows the person who is a member of this role or user who is a member of this role connect to any database. And with this, I would like to show a demo. And in this demo, this is on the Azure AD authentication itself for SQL 2022. I will review the Azure Arc in the Azure portal, review the setup for SQL Server, first of all for the host machine, then for the SQL Server instance. Review the Azure AD admin blade that allows to set up the AD admin, check the certificates and application that is created by the system. And then finally, once the AD admin is created, to connect to Azure Active Directory from a SQL Server instance. And finally, use one of these role database connector for SQL Server login. So let's go to the demo. And the first thing that we do is to look at the Azure portal under the Azure Arc. This is the place where the instance and the hosts are registered. So if we click on it, there's a option servers. When I click on the servers, I see that there are different servers here, different hosts that are hosting SQL servers. So the Windows machines or Linux machines. And the important thing is that the machine that I have an interest or I'm going to work with right now is Pluto 123, and it is connected. So that means that the communication between the on-premises and Azure is established through the Azure Arc. So if we click on this particular host, we can see the information about the host here. The important thing is the version of the agent. This is the Azure Arc agent that is installed on this host machine. And this version should be kept always as the last. And there's also the access control for this particular resource. So the person or the user who is setting up the AD admin must be a contributor. must have the contributor role here. Going to the SQL servers, there are different SQL servers. I have one of them, which is CTP2. This is CTP 2.0. Again, important thing is to look at the status. It is connected, so the communication is in place. If I click on it, I get the information about the instance, the CTP 2.0 instance, and there's a Azure Active Directory blade that specifies or allows to set the AD admin. In this case, I did it already because it takes some time, a few minutes. So what I did is I set the AD user test SQL Server here, and I use the service managed certificate and service managed application registration. These are the options that are created by the system. There's also an option that customer can provide the certificate and customer can provide the application. As you can see here, this option requires a key vault that I indicated here. And once I save all of this, there's a save button here, and finally the AD admin was created. I got the information about the certificate name and application registration name. The names are the same, but the objects are different. So let me just copy one of this name, and let's go back to first to key vault, finding the key vault that I was using, and looking at the certificates. And you can see that the system created the certificate by the time when I recorded it with this name. There's also the access policy that is required for users who are setting up the AD admins. So I have different users here who have permissions to do it. If we look at the typical permission for key, secret, and certificate permissions, usually what's needed is get, list, and create. But it is also important to allow this permission to the host machine itself, in this case to the Pluto 123, with the permissions that have get and list from the access policy. The next step is to go to Azure Active Directory and look for app registrations, and simply copy the application that was created by the system. And you can see the application is here. The important things are the permissions. The permissions were granted by the system. However, there's one part, which is the ground admin consent that I talk about it, that requires a higher permission, either must be granted by global admin or privileged role administrator. Without this, the Azure Active Directory is not fully functional. You will not be able to create users because this particular permission allows access to the Microsoft Graph. So this is one-time process that has to be provided, and once it's done, this application can be used to set up other admins, so move from one admin to another admin. With this, let's go to SSMS. And what I like to do is I like to connect using the admin that we created or that we set up, the test SQL Server admin, connect to the CTP2 instance. It is important to check in the options that the encrypt connection, especially that the trust server certificate is set, and then we can connect. Here, in this case, it doesn't ask me for a password because I was connected before, so it just it caches the token. I have a script here that allows that runs in master, and that allows to create a login for the AD user. So this is the first user that we will be created in master, or the first login that will be created in master. It has to be done by the AD admin. So let's execute this. And then let's see if this login is available here. And you can see, yes, this SQL 2022 user login was created. It's under the external login, which means that this is the AD login. With this, I'm able to connect to master as this user, and we can do. So let's connect as this user. Let's check the options, especially that the trust service certificate is set. This time it will ask me for a password. And as you can see, I'm connected to the database. So I'm connected to server. So let's execute this, and I'm in master. However, I created another user database test, and this particular user cannot connect to this database because it only has a permission to connect to master. That's where the login was created. And this is a nice segue to the presentation that Srđan will be providing on the Purview and the roles and privileges and the policy. I'm going to show it from the T-SQL standpoint, and then Srđan will show all of this from the Purview standpoint. So what it means is we support the new server roles. And one of these roles is here. This is the database connector role that allows a member of this role to connect to any database, specifically also to this test database. So let's make the SQL 2022 user a member of this role. And let's check if this is the case. And as you can see, the user 2022 is part of database connector role. With this, I can connect to the database, but I need to do two things more, run a couple of dbcc commands to make sure that this assignment is quicker. It's documented. And then the other thing I have to do, I have to disconnect and reconnect this user. So let's connect again to the user SQL 2022. It is connected. Let's open a new session. As you can see, I'm in master. Can I go to testDB? Yes, I can. You can see I can now connect to this particular user database, but I can also connect to any database. So this concludes my demo. Let me go back to the slides. There's a documentation part that we encourage you to read. And then with this, I would like to hand it over the presentation to Srđan to talk about the Microsoft Purview access policies for SQL Server 2022.
Thank you, Mirek, for introducing me and for great presentation on Azure AD authentication. Today I will talk about Microsoft Purview access policies for SQL Server, and this continues in a great way on a story that Mirek just brought up. Here is the agenda for the Purview part. I will do a quick overview of Microsoft Purview capabilities. Then we would focus on data policies and show them through demo. I will then explain some technical details about the Purview policies and provide documentation pointers. Before going into details, I would like to provide a high-level overview of Microsoft Purview, since this might be a completely new service for you. Microsoft Purview is actually a set of services that provide unified data governance and compliance capabilities across multiple resources. Some of them are, of course, Microsoft services. The others could be actually any data sources. And on a high level, Microsoft Purview does data mapping in terms of mapping your data sources, extracting a metadata about them so that you as a data officer could have a clear picture of your data estate, and then on top of that provide certain services. There are services for data producers and customers, also for data officers. And our focus today would be on this data policy part. What is data policy? Data policy basically provide centrally controlled single pane of glass experience for providing access to data sources, and this access is uniform across services, meaning that you will have the similar experience regardless of do you access SQL service on-prem or Azure SQL DB or storage or Cosmos DB. So the guiding principles apply, and also it enables managing all of these resources at scale. Since the focus of this talk is SQL Server 2022, let's talk about scope that would be delivered in this time frame. The goal for this release is to support complete read-only access scenario to this system. And that means that we will provide read-only access to data through data reader role, but also access to the metadata through the DevOps roles. So for the data reader role, user will be able to gain access to tables and views, either directly through the policy assignment that we will see a bit later, and through self-service workflows that are planned for GA. Metadata access is provided through the DevOps roles, where basically the user will have access to system both database and server level views and functions. Depending of the security sensitive views and functions are under security auditor role, and the rest of the views and functions are under performance monitor role. So in this discussion I mentioned of course some roles, and before kind of going deeper into it, maybe it would be useful to understand how these roles actually map to the security concepts that you are familiar with. These policies basically comprise of roles, and these are a set of actions. And I mentioned a couple of roles previously, but now let's use SQL Performance Monitor as an example. If you look at these actions, you will see this kind of familiar path definition of actions. These are not exactly the ARM paths, but are very similar to that in terms that these present a kind of hierarchy through which you could see different actions in the end. So if we look at the SQL Performance Monitor role, you will see first that it has a connect action. That is, of course, very important, because without that action, a user would not get access to the database at the first time. The implication of this is also that when using a Purview way of defining permissions, you do not need to explicitly specify logins or database users in the database. The permissions to connect to the database comes through these Purview actions. And then you see more detailed actions. For example, you could run views, system views and functions that are related to the performance state. And this is the set of functions and views that were previously covered with view server performance state SQL permission. You also could see here that there are database level permissions just below. And the difference between the Purview actions and permissions in SQL engine is that, for example, server performance state SQL permission includes also database performance state SQL permission. But in Purview, these two permissions are distinct. So you have kind of more granularity. So to be precise, view server performance state SQL permission includes both server performance state and database performance state actions, while view database performance state SQL permission maps only to database performance. This performance monitor role also covers access to general metadata about the SQL and database, and this is what is covered by view definition and view any definition permissions. Now let's look a bit how these policies and permissions apply to Azure Purview. Now let's see how these policies could be applied at scale. In Azure, resources are often grouped into hierarchy. On top of that hierarchy, you had a subscription, then resource group, and then individual group resources that could on their own contain certain containers for SQL that would be databases, for storage accounts that would be containers, etc. And then one thing that is important to point out that these permissions or access that you're providing through Purview applies only through Azure AD users, and this is where Purview builds on top of Azure AD authentication work that Mirek just talked about. So When you have that, you define policies, and policies contains a set of rules that basically connect Azure AD users with certain role, and then you assign these permissions to some of these resources into the hierarchy. If this role that policy is about is something that is general, applicable to all kind of resources, like data reader, you could apply this policy to the resource that is higher in hierarchy, like Azure subscription or a resource group. And with that, you will provide read-only access to all the underlying resources. If you have something more specific, like the performance monitor I talked about, then of course these policies become applicable only to certain type of resources that this role applies to. So for example, SQL Performance Monitor is something that you could apply across Arc-enabled SQL Server, managed instance, and SQL database. Now let's see some of these things through the demo. And during this demo, I will do a walkthrough where I will show you how you could configure Azure SQL Server on Azure Arc to receive Purview policies. Then you will see Microsoft Purview end of the configuration. We will review read the data access policies and show how these policies apply to the certain resource. Let's start this demo by exploring SQL Server on Azure Arc. For the purpose of this demo, I created a SQL Server called Finance SQL, and you could see that this SQL is Arc-enabled one. Purview integration configuration is under Azure Active Directory Blade. You could see Azure Active Directory authentication enabled above, and there is a Purview specific piece. You need to enable Arc SQL Server for Microsoft Purview. What you need first is to enable external policy-based authorization, then provide a Purview endpoint for the account to which you would like to associate this SQL Server, and then you will also receive app registration information that you will need later for registering this specific SQL Server with Microsoft Purview. I already mentioned that there is associated Purview account, and here is this account. All of the governance of this account you do through the Purview Governance Portal experience. Let's just wait a couple of seconds for this experience to load. This experience contains all of the functionalities that you would need for interacting with Microsoft Purview. And here is the data map I talked about. And in this data map, you could see this Finance SQL that I've previously shown. If you go to Edit, you will see some details about this server in terms where it is registered in portal. But you will also see this very important switch that is Data Use Management, that basically allows data access policies to be assigned to this resource. And you also see application ID that I need to connect this specific Arc SQL Server with its Purview account. In order for you to be able to manage this registration and also do some policy assignments, a user needs to have certain permissions on this Purview account. Specifically, you would need role data source to be the data source admin for the registration, and also for policy publishing, you need to be a part of the policy authors group. Now let's switch to policy publishing and explain a bit about that. So here you could see multiple policies that are already here, and we are interested to see more about this data reader experience that I talked about. We could quick edit to go into the editor experience, and each policy contains name, also a description about the policy it does, and the policy now could contain one or multiple statements. All of these statements have a single format. So basically, the first is a kind of verb. Do you allow certain actions to take place? Then what roles would you like to assign to which person? And in this example, we would like to assign Chris permissions to read data inside our finance SQL server. So with this simple statement, you basically assign this access. After you assign access, you go to the publish experience, where you basically select a server on which you want to publish a certain policy. And what you could see here in this experience, that this policy is published to the finance SQL server. Changes of the policy do not require republishing. Once published, all the changes would be automatically applied. Now let's see something about the experience on the SQL engine side. If you go to the SQL Management Studio and then connect to this server with Chris Reader account, you will see that you will be able to connect easily. Then you could start running queries. So for example, we could see what is as a username of this user and what would be its as user ID. If we run this statement, we see two things. First, that the user is Azure AD user, and that is correctly recognized. And then you will see that as user ID is null. We could also check, in addition to as user ID, we could also check user ID, and that would be 0, meaning that this user maps to the public role, but from as user ID we see that it's not mapped to any particular login. And that showcases in a very good way that basically this user is kind of virtualized user, that it doesn't exist in the database, and the connect to this server, and here specifically master database is provided through these external policies that we define through Purview. Now we could, as this user is granted reader permissions on whole server, you could switch context to some of the databases, so we could switch context for Adventure Works database here. And then we could do the query of some data that is already in that database. So, for example, we could check for the first and last name of the users from the person table in this database. Now, what we could also do, what would be interested to show, is what if we go beside these data reader permission, and for example, what will happen if we try to read from some system view. For example, let's try to read performance counters. What we see here is a clear error message showing that we do not have permissions. But what's even more important, that this view performance state permission that we are missing, is that we could see here from this example that it's also checked for this external policy action, which in a reader role we do not have. Now let's back to slides. We've seen that some policies were applied on SQL Engine, but how it works. With SQL Server 2022, SQL Engine has embedded a Purview SDK. That Purview SDK is in charge of pulling policies from the Purview site where they are published every couple of minutes. Also, for onboarded permission operations like reading data or performance-related system views or security-related system views that we've seen in previous examples, you can see that permission checks for both local and the permissions that are coming from the external data source as a Purview are both checks. Now we could also explore these Purview policies in SQL, and this is super helpful for the troubleshooting purposes. So for that, we exposed a couple of views and store procedures that could help in this regard. So we could run server external policy actions to see a list of all actions. The same is for the roles. And then we have a couple of views that give more insights about how these actions and roles map to. We could then see what external principles are defined in these policies, basically figuring out what Azure AD users could be granted access through these external policies. Then we could see also how this maps end-to-end from the Azure principal to the role and then to the particular data actions, figuring out basically what external users, what Azure AD users, what actions they were granted through these policies. I also mentioned on the previous slide that these policies are not applied immediately and that they are pulled with certain interval. If you want to refresh these policies immediately, you could use external policy refresh store procedure, and that is of course super useful when you're doing some live demos or if you're doing policy exploration. But of course, even without that, eventually the policies would be synchronized. To learn more, you could go to these useful links, especially if you want to learn something more about the Microsoft Purview and how it's how it applied to different Azure products. Also, there are detailed tutorials about provisioning access for SQL Server on Azure Arc. This is more detailed and how to description on what we showed during this short walkthrough. And of course, you could see and check how you could provision access on a higher level, for example, resource group and a subscription. So with that, you could, for example, play and see how to provide read access for both SQL Server and Arc and storage example. Before opening the session for questions, I would like to say big thanks for all of you who watched this recording, follow us, and I would also want to remind you to provide the feedback for both of the session and the conference. That would mean a lot. Thanks.